Hello. Have a listen to Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the guardian of the UK government's finances, announcing a cut to the payment that pensioners get for their energy bills. This was in July last year.
Today, I am making the difficult decision that those not in receipt of pension credit or certain other means-tested benefits will no longer receive the winter fuel payment from this year onwards.
Now have a listen to the Prime Minister speaking today in May this year.
We want to ensure that as we go forward, more pensioners are eligible for winter fuel payment.
Yep, the government has changed its policy after months and months of defending it and explaining why the policy was necessary in the first place. What has gone on? What does this tell us? And what does it mean for British politics going forward? We will discuss all of that on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio and Chris is at Westminster. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
Busy day for you?
Yeah, splash of news.
And we're joined by Luke Sullivan, who was Keir Starmer's former political director, to help us untangle the politics. Hello, Luke.
Hello.
What does a political director do, by the way? I mean, I kind of know from the old days, but just explain to newscasters.
Interesting. Well, it always seemed to me that basically the bad news sort of flowed up. So whatever couldn't be fixed or managed normally ended up at my door.
So if loads of Labour MPs were complaining about the means testing of the winter fuel allowance, they would be complaining to you.
Yep. Amongst anybody they could find. But yes, absolutely.
But expecting you to do something about it.
Yeah. Listen, agony aunt, counsellor. Yeah.
OK, well, Chris, just explain to us, set the scene. It's Prime Minister's questions, as usual, midday, Wednesday, very early on. News happens.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, even though Prime Minister's questions is like the kind of flagship moment of the kind of parliamentary week in a kind of public way, wildly atypical of lots of goings on at Westminster, but nonetheless it's that kind of set piece event. I think it is fair to say, sort of journalistically, it is rarely a kind of news-making event in a headline sense. You know, you might get the Prime Minister, the leader of the opposition, or others saying stuff that fits into the particular news story of the day or something that they haven't said on whatever that's happening somewhere else, etc., etc. You don't get that many announcements with a capital A, and that's what we got from Keir Starmer today. It's been in the offing for a little while, but it was specifically an announcement, a change of policy, a U-turn. But it was kind of a big U-turn, but half an announcement because
It's not even half.
Well, maybe not even half. Exactly. He says he wants to ensure that more pensioners get the winter fuel payment than currently get it, but can't yet say which ones who used to get it and now don't might get it again, and crucially, whether they'll get it this coming winter or might have to wait until the one after.
Luke, you can see me and Chris are struggling to find the correct name for this, whether it's a U-turn, a partial U-turn, a hint of a U-turn, a half of a U,
it's a
kind of like a J.
It is a U-turn.
Well, I mean, but I don't know if it is a U-turn, because we don't know how many new pensioners are going to get it under the new regime. So it could be a very partial U-turn, if only a few extra pensioners get it.
But if it's, I hate to get literal here, but
no, please do.
If it's a partial U-turn, is it not like an R-turn? Because you've like only gone halfway and then you go off in a different direction. You know what I mean? As opposed to going back to where you started.
No, but it is interesting here because I think I'm looking at this from a policy point of view, having just read the email from the Institute for Fiscal Studies about, do you change the level of the means test? Do you make pension credit more generous to get around this problem? You're looking at it from a political point of view, which is actually Keir Starmer has now changed his position fairly fundamentally on a quite totemic thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point because I do sometimes wrestle with the political phrase U-turn because people don't really use the word U-turn, I don't think, in sort of normal life, unless it's literally driving. Yeah,
and you've driven the wrong way.
Yeah. But because it does have sort of connotations. It has pejorative connotations. As if it's sort of a bad thing. Whereas obviously you can have an argument that if you've looked at the evidence and you've listened to people and then you've decided you made a mistake, or that the circumstances have changed that allow you to do something different, then of course you can make an argument that says that's entirely rational, and the alternative would be a government that walked around with its fingers in his ears and didn't listen to anything about anyone at any time. So I wrestle with the word in terms of how it's perceived. Anyway, I feel we might have gone down a sort of vocabulary rabbit hole here.
Yeah, I think ultimately, from the government's point of view, they'll be pretty happy with how it's landed. I think, the key thing from their point of view will be the public hearing via the BBC and other news organisations that the government's listened and changed its policy. And I think us in the Westminster bubble often focus on a U-turn. Is it a bad thing? Ultimately, I think if you look at the polling, you look at the long history of governments changing their minds or making changes to policy, that ultimately, as long as they're where the voters are, that's no bad thing.
What about, Luke, the critique that says, why do it now? Why not wait until you can actually answer those fundamental questions, like who will now get it and whether they'll get it this winter?
Look, these are reasonable questions to ask. The government's going to have to set out exactly how it's going to be. That's going to take some time. But in many ways, it sort of lances the boil of something that's been knocking around that people have been asking. And, to your other point about PMQs, well, often PMQs provide that sort of constitutional check-in, that check on government, and something gets ahead of steam. Actually, often the best way, as Keir did very cleverly today, he rather took Kemi by surprise and torpedoed her 6 questions, almost to the point where there's some suggestion she hadn't actually heard the Prime Minister.
We'll come on to that in a second, but just with the actual the details of winter fuel payments. So I mentioned that email from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the number crunchers, and I've got it on my laptop right now. So under the old winter fuel payments, they were £200 or £300 a year for households with a pensioner aged over 80. They were, because they weren't means tested, 11.6 million pensioners were eligible for them, and that cost the government a total of £2.2 billion. Under the new Rachel Reeves regime, you could only get winter fuel allowance if you were receiving the pension credit benefit, and that basically took the number of recipients down by 90% to 1.3 million, and that saved the government. In other words, they spend less of £1.5 billion a year. I suppose, Luke, though, the question is that the change is being made. We await the details, but is the political damage is it permanent damage that can't be fixed by this change?
I think ultimately the government will judge it by what happens in the next general election, and I think they'll hope that in 4 years' time, the general election's a very long way away, that it won't be front of centre for voters' minds. I do think there is an interesting point here, which is this was a decision taken, and it was a really hard one. I don't think anyone thinks that
the original decision.
The original decision wasn't a decision taken out of any sort of this was a position they wanted to make. I think Rachel was very clear at the time when it was announced back end of July that this was a really hard decision that the government was having to take because of the state of the finances. And this is obviously against the background, and I think we'll get onto it later, but there are really hard decisions going on about how does the government spend its money, how do departments choose, and it's clearly a political choice that Rachel and Keir have made, which is they want to try and take a bit of the sting out of winter fuel as an issue.
I was struck today, Luke, and I'm intrigued by your sort of analysis of this. And I take your point about how the government needs to sort of manage the party, and this has been something that's been sort of flooding into MPs' inboxes. And I also take the point that the whole business of how you go about setting an alternative threshold, both the budgeting of that, but then just the practicalities of that to try and make it as simple as possible, both for pensioners and indeed for the government. But I'm struck that it doesn't seem to me, but tell me if you disagree, politically sustainable for the government to have made an announcement like this today and for us to get to the budget in the autumn or any point between now and then, whatever the threshold turns out to be, the new one, and it not be something that kicks in the winter that is coming.
Yeah, the timing question.
Yeah, timing is an interesting. I think the line that I've seen being briefed is at the next fiscal event. Now, what counts as the next fiscal event?
Well, it's the budget.
But we all assume the budget.
But it could be the spending review, maybe?
No. I mean, so I'm told it won't be the spending review. Right. They don't regard the spending review as a fiscal event. I mean, it's interesting because last summer the announcement came, on its own, in isolation, if you like. I suppose I'm less intrigued here by the process. I mean, I'm obsessed by the process. Obviously, it's my job to be. But I'm just thinking for newscasters who might have previously got winter fuel payments and wonder if they might get it again. Obviously, as I say, there's the whole threshold question. But surely, given the political heat the government has taken, having said it is going to shift that threshold, it can't surely allow all of those pensioners who lost out because of the initial policy to all go through another winter without some of them getting it again.
I think the Prime Minister's sort of made clear he wants to sort of take action in this area as quickly as possible. I think there are some.
Do you think he has to? Do you think he has to sort it by this coming winter?
I think it goes to my opening point, which was ultimately from a sort of political and comms point of view. I think the government will be pretty happy that it is being viewed as a U-turn. Most people are going to hear the government are U-turning on that. That I think does buy them some time to.
Yeah, but it might buy them time in the summer, but it's not going to buy them time through another winter, is it?
Well, I think that the key thing for them is they've signalled that it will take the heat out of it. Now, I think probably to your point, does pressure build if at the budget they're not really clear exactly what it is and what the timescale is? Yes, I'm sure that will be something that people keep to push. But I think in terms of the immediate taking the sting out of it as an issue, I think it probably will have the sort of desired effect. Mm-hmm. Obviously people are going to keep on asking questions, but I think it will be very easy for government ministers on, your show and others just to say, look, there's a process, we'll make an announcement at a later stage.
But Chris, this is a victory for Labour MPs against the Labour leadership, isn't it? And then once you get one victory, you start looking for your next one, and maybe this would encourage them to start arguing and trying to push for the proposed changes to the welfare system to be watered down.
Yeah, and there's two sides to the psychology of this within the Labour Party and within the government. I'd be fascinated to hear Luke's reflections on this. So on the one hand, I was talking to some of the Labour MPs who are intending to be rebels on these benefits changes that the government announced a few months ago, and there'll be a vote at some point, we think, next month. Incidentally, talking to folk around all of that, looks like there's 40, 50-ish MPs who'd be up for voting against. There might be another 50-ish who are softer in their opposition, who might be persuadable to abstain, but also might be persuadable to be loyal to the government and the whips, the party managers trying to persuade those who are currently saying they would vote against to abstain or disappear for the day or whatever, and some of those who might be just about willing to abstain to say, well, actually, it would be dreadfully helpful if you were loyal to the government, at least for this particular vote, etc., etc. So yes, some of those would-be rebels are sensing, oh, well, if the government will listen on one thing, maybe it'll listen on the other. The counter-argument you might hear in a sort of party management sense is, well, actually, no, we could be willing to change on winter fuel, for which the government has taken quite a lot of heat. But the argument you hear at the moment within government is, look, the benefits changes have to happen. The welfare state is, in their view, unsustainable in terms of the ballooning cost of it, and they want to press ahead with the changes. And perhaps the volume of criticism that Labour MPs have faced has not been as deep and as broad, at least yet, as on winter fuel. But yeah, the psychology of the extent to which one U-turn might telegraph the next, or indeed the opposite, is fascinating.
Yeah, well, as a seasoned professional in this area, Luke, does one U-turn lead to another? Because the people who force you to U-turn get an appetite for making a U-turn.
No, I get the argument. I'm not sure that's true. Ultimately, I think where we've got to on winter fuel is, I think, look, they are linked in the sense of these are problems that Labour MPs are starting to have to grapple with, and one of the difficulties about being government, and it is a change of mindset from being in opposition. And the Labour Party was really, really good at opposition. We were brilliant at it, but actually governing is hard, and the trade-offs. And ultimately there are huge decisions that this government's got to make about trying to balance the books. Winter fuel was one decision they took. And, I don't think anybody is in any doubt that the welfare system needs reforming. The question is, how does that reform look like? The government's, there's no doubt the welfare bill, when it's published later this month, early next month, is going to be a really big deal. There is obviously a lot of, this is the issue that historically for any Labour government is a difficult one to manage, because it goes to the core of how Labour MPs view themselves, like why they got into public life, what they want to do. I think at the moment, winter fuels are much more in lights because there are real losers at the moment. You know, there is a sort of theoretical nature as to who the losers are in the welfare bill. We haven't seen the full analysis of what exactly that's going to be, but there's no doubt that, you know, this is the huge, you know, political management task that's facing the government, and on which, you know, not only is it a major piece of legislation from a reform piece of mind, but it's also key to how do the government's finances stack up, and how do they balance the books?
Luke, you were saying there about how, in your view, how good opposition Labour was. That you seem to be hinting that Labour has not been good enough in government.
No, I think the point I was trying to make was, being an MP, I think, you know, one of the things that the Labour Party became really good at was being against things. And I think one of the changes that Keir made when he was leader was trying to make that culture shift from taking an easy, we're against this. And actually, you can see in the same way where the Tories are at the moment, which is, you know, Kemi was against the winter fuel cut, even though she'd previously been in favour of introducing means testing, because that's the easy political place to be in. I think the Labour Party had been in opposition for so long, you know, like there was a whole sort of generation of Labour MPs who were never in government. And that does get you in a different place. And actually, you know, being an MP where you've got to sort of stick by decisions your government's making is really tough. And, you know, I think the reality is the welfare bill will be the first real test of a lot of Labour MPs as to, you know, how they manage that and how the government sticks together. And you could see
Liz Kendall today, the Work and Pension Secretary, doing a speech where she was arguing that it's not cutting the welfare bill that's cruel, it's the welfare system itself that she sees it traps people in welfare that's cruel. So she's trying to massively just reframe that whole conversation ahead of this massive row that's brewing. Chris, Luke just mentioned Kemi Badenoch. What do Team Kemi say about whether she actually missed this announcement from the PM? Although it was a funny kind of announcement, as we've discussed. Was she not listening? Did she not hear it? Do they have an answer?
Well, I have to say, looking down from the press gallery, surrounded as I was, and I always am, on Wednesday lunchtime by political journalists watching on, the press gallery was aghast when Kemi Badenoch asked that question about whether there had been a U-turn. It was actually not her first question. It came 2 or 3 questions down in her set of questions, because we were all sort of screaming, well, he's already U-turned. Now, the argument that she and her team make is that they were pushing for details. It's back to our conversation at the start about, you know, what is a U-turn, etc., etc. What about the thresholds? Now, the Prime Minister had said some pensioners would be, you know, he wants to see get the winter fuel payment who are currently not getting it. In other words, the implication of that is that the threshold is going to move. Now, to be fair to Kemi Badenoch, the Commons is very loud and noisy and all of that, and also these announcements in that forum are actually pretty rare. But I can tell you there were some Conservatives texting me and others in the press gallery during PMQs with their heads in their hands, because in their view it showed a complete absence of a kind of fleet of foot. She might have heard it, but she wasn't listening, was the critique. And hence she did get that question where she asked, is it a U-turn? And the Prime Minister said, well, I've already said, you know, ... and then sort of, you know, embellished a bit his initial answer. As I say, to be fair, it is noisy in there. When we had to check with the Prime Minister's team the exact language had he said some pensioners or had he said all pensioners? Some people heard all when he said some. So, you know, that is the context. But it was as far as some Tory MPs are concerned, it was a rough old half an hour for Kemi Badenoch.
I should just say, me and Luke are in the studio and we're watching Chris and chatting to him on a massive TV screen, and he keeps holding up a pen. And because it's really close to the camera, it's huge. But mainly, it doesn't have an end. Like, it's been chewed right off.
Yeah.
Is this BBC efficiency cuts?
No, I'm just terrible with biros. And
Other pens are available.
So this thing, actually, during the huddles, as they're known, which is when journalists huddle around a table next to the press gallery and talk to the Prime Minister's official spokesman and political staff, and then do the same with the opposition. I was using said high quality ballpoint pen, and it fell apart. Yeah, it's just crumbling, but it's still working.
Well, now here's a terrible segue to another political story today, although it is related to the one we've just been talking about. What do you use pens for? Writing things. What's Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister's government department, been doing? Writing a memo a couple of months ago with 8 proposed tax rises that Rachel Reeves might have thought about introducing at the spring statement in March, but which she didn't. But this memo has appeared in the Telegraph newspaper. What do you think's going on there, Luke?
I mean, I think this is one of these cases where you often don't want to see how the sausage is made. And you definitely don't want to see it published.
No, but this is somebody who presumably does want people to see how the sausage is made.
Well, I mean,
somebody close to Angela Rayner.
A 2-month-old sausage.
I mean, it's an interesting, and there can be. We can go down a whole rabbit warren of who leaked it, why, and speaking to very fine journalists who I know have been on the end of multiple leaks in the past. Trying to play the game of who's leaked it for what purpose. Is a bit of a fool's
errand. Because things
errand.
can be leaked to show why they didn't happen. Things can be leaked to try and make them happen. Yeah. Things can be leaked so that they never happen. Yeah, lots of options.
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, I think it's no doubt a great scoop from the Telegraph that private discussions are going on. But I do sort of think this is a bit like. When you pretend your parents never have a row, the interesting thing is
what are you going to say then?
The interest and my parents never row, but I think it's one of those ones where it's interesting it's in the public domain, and it's no doubt interesting that it's there. But I think the more interesting thing once you get away from the sort of Westminster parlour games is the strategic questions that are facing this government, which are how do you make the books balance? It's an incredibly difficult sort of financial inheritance that the government have found themselves in. Going back to the discussion we just had on winter fuel, which is, there are really tough discussions going on in government, at the heart of government, between the Treasury and the government departments about what is their spending settlement for the next 3 years. You've got we had a spending review just a couple of months ago. We've got a budget coming up in October or November, unclear quite when, but it'll be around that time. These are the big discussions that are taking heart at the centre of government, and this is going to shape the politics for the next 3 or 4 years.
It's not a parlour game, though, is it? When the Deputy Prime Minister is setting out ideas that are completely at odds with what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor feel in their gut should be the direction of the Labour government, and Angela Rayner is the Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I think it's perfectly reasonable that officials and politicians are having conversations about the different range of options that are possibly on the table.
So it's not unusual to write a memo of this much detail with this much evidence and this specific proposals and send it to, even when it's none of your business really, because you look after housing and local government rather than the budget.
Look, I think first and foremost, Deputy Prime Minister is in a different position. That it is perfectly legitimate to have conversations about strategy, the different options on the table. I think, the thing that we pretend is that conversations don't take place, and actually
the point is, though, isn't the interesting thing here, like, sorry to interrupt, is that of course conversations take place, but the curiosity here is that this got written down and then ended up getting leaked, and it's much easier for things to leak if they've been written down, as opposed to if it's a conversation, at the end of a cabinet meeting or whatever, where somebody sets out, well, what about doing X and Y? Of course that happens, and we should be very grown up about, of course, acknowledging that that happens in a government, and you'll have a range of views. But to write it down, which has an element of formality to it, and then it's then sitting there as something that, via whatever means, and I've no idea who leaked it or why, but via whatever means, there is then something that can end up leaking.
Yeah, and that's the counter argument. I mean, look, I famously try not to write anything down. I think that may be just coming from the, my background in a whip's office where, try to write absolutely nothing down and keep it in your head. However, this is part of when you're in government, people do write things down. Now, for whatever reason that it's in the public domain, I know for one that whoever has leaked it, that I'm certain that they're not going to get their desired outcome, because ultimately I think the Prime Minister is somebody who takes a lot of store in. He doesn't mind. He's very welcoming of proper discussion and debate around things, but
not on the front page of the Daily
Not
Telegraph.
on the front page. And that, I think that's that was the jaw-dropping moment. That is whoever has done it. And there's been a couple along the way of things that have been leaked from this government. I think Sue Gray's salary was another one, which was a bit of a
came my way,
a jaw-dropping moment. I think it's in the public domain, and that is not that for all sorts of reasons is not good, and it's not the way that this Prime Minister likes to do business.
On that point though, Luke, I mean, Keir Starmer really well professionally. Yeah. Should we be looking out for a little subtle slapdown of Angela Rayner, whether she leaked it or not, to just make sure that everyone knows he's in charge?
No,
or is that not his style?
It's not.
It shouldn't be reading, looking for clues.
No, and look, ultimately, Keir takes great store in people. I mean, his great peeve, other than people being late to meetings, which he absolutely hates, is if you are in a meeting with him and you're discussing something and you don't put forward your view. He hates you then trying to reopen stuff on the side. And look, I ultimately think it's part of a good functioning government that people are putting forward, ideas, that they're looking at the full range of options. Ultimately, the Chancellor will decide the taxation policy with the Prime Minister, and they believe in collective responsibility. And I have no doubt that whatever position the government reaches, Angela is somebody who would always put great store in having part of the discussion, having her say, and then she will wholeheartedly be behind collective responsibility of the government.
On the face of it, given that this thing has seen the light of day a couple of months after it was written, on the face of it, it doesn't seem wildly unhelpful for Angela Rayner that this is out there. At a point where Labour MPs have been worrying about winter fuel prior to today, at least, and worry about the benefits cuts, and you have some within the parliamentary party wondering if those fiscal rules that the government has set itself to try and project a kind of economic responsibility are the right ones. It's not, as I say, I've no idea who leaked it and for what reason, but outwardly it doesn't seem wildly unhelpful for the Deputy Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. I think that is probably fair. And that's, that gets us back into who's leaked it, why, for what purpose. And I think that's all true. However, I think ultimately there's a series of really difficult discussions, strategy calls going on, which is, how does the government balance the books? How does it cut its cloth accordingly? How does it deliver on its priorities? Yeah. And, and that, in my view, from a public policy point of view, yes, from a political, who's up, who's down in the Labour Party, your question, I think, is very fair. But actually, in terms of what matters to the country, it's the bigger strategic calls that is the ones that is going to have the longer, life and importance for the country.
I think ultimately, from me today, what today shows is that the pre-budget period has started now. Like normally, this would be starting in a couple of months' time. Like it's starting now, and actually, because the spending review isn't a full fiscal event where you talk about tax policy, it means that actually the spending review, there's limited scope there for a lot of these issues to be addressed. So we're going to be talking about what's going to be in the budget, like every day a bit now until October or November.
Luke, when people say that Keir Starmer is insufficiently political, are they right?
No, you don't get to be the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister without being a very good political operator. I think what they mean when they're talking about that are other ways they believe politicians or leaders should act. I think Keir is a very untypical leader in the way he leads.
In what sense?
Sorry?
In what sense?
I think he's very collegiate. I think he doesn't view doing politics in some of the ways that traditionally people are rewarded in doing them. So, ultimately he sees it as a job, one that he knows he has to work very hard at. He came to it, later in life after he'd had a really successful career. He's someone who doesn't particularly like hanging around or hates hanging around in the bars and doing some of the things that would traditionally be seen as the ways of making it in Westminster.
Yeah, just on that point. So I should interject. I bumped into a senior Labour MP this morning. I know that's sometimes used by journalists to describe any Labour MP, but this person, genuinely a senior Labour MP, who said, you know what, it's not like when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were running the party, because they, even when they had their back against the wall, knew that they had to keep the parliamentary party on side, and they'd come over and they'd have us in and there'd be lots of chats and all of that. And the critique from this person who wants to see the Prime Minister succeed was that kind of, if you like, as you describe it, lack of desire to do some of the kind of Westminstery things that the Prime Minister just might not be that keen on. And I'm not suggesting a Prime Minister would spend vast amounts of time propping up the bar, but does he do enough of the sort of soft stuff, if you like, people management stuff that you need to do?
I mean, I think it's a fair. This isn't a new thing that's been sort of said to him. It's clear that 10 months into a Labour government, the going is harder than it's been for Keir's leadership for a long time. The realities of being in government. I think it's natural. Ultimately looking at his diary and knowing how much time he's spending on international matters. He's done a hell of a lot of international travel because he's having to sort of prioritise some of those relationships. It has meant, I think, he's not been around in Westminster as much. It is one of those things, it doesn't come naturally to him to spend huge sums of time on this stuff. And I think it's partly how he views it's important to use his time, which is actually getting on and doing the job. And I think he's always very aware of how he can maximise his time to have most impact. And look, it's really tough because you can fill his diary, any politician, but especially when you come to like the Prime Minister or senior cabinet minister, you could spend your time talking to colleagues all day, every day, and getting that balance. Also making sure you've got a senior team who are able to delegate those conversations to. And, Keir has a really strong team in which he tries to find that balance. And, ultimately he empowers his team on a staff level as well to do a lot of that outreach to maximise the sort of bang for their buck that they can have.
No, Chris, I thought you had to go, but you keep asking questions, which makes me think you're quite chilled.
Yeah, I'm just thoroughly enjoying the conversation. Are you certain, Luke, that Keir Starmer will lead the Labour Party into the next election?
Yes, yes. I mean, I saw there was a flurry of excitement last week, but yes.
No, and that flurry was because he was asked that question and he gave a sort of non-answer, which just makes me think if you're intending to do it, that's not the sort of question you would non-answer. Like you would say yes.
Apart from the one thing I would say, I wasn't in the kind of collection, the gaggle of journalists when that question was put, but having frequently been in it, I have seen on numerous occasions, and I'm not just referring to this Prime Minister or indeed just Prime Ministers, and Luke will be well aware of this kind of scenario, where a question is asked of a politician and they give an inadvertently ambiguous answer.
As opposed to a deliberately ambiguous.
It was a David Cameron one, wasn't there, where he was, I think, was it a James Landau question in his kitchen?
Yes.
Well, no, the thing is that
Although
was
I think
not...
that was a big... That was...
he was explicit,
I think that
was the problem for him.
I think that was intentional. But yes, that was in the kitchen, wasn't it? But anyway, I think sometimes out of a desire to not commit to saying something, a politician can inadvertently let a hair run, which they didn't intend to.
Right. Chris, you do have to go now, I'm being told.
This was a tremendous
The pen
conversation.
shop's calling.
I'm
The
worried
shop
about.
shuts in 2 minutes.
I mean, I'm worried about that pen. It does rather look like an offensive weapon.
For people who are watching on YouTube, it's got a substantial amount of ink still in it.
It's got life in the old pen, yeah.
Can I
Surely
keep
there's
this?
a newscast pen somewhere.
Can I keep
No,
this
that's
pen
an area
going?
of March we've not explored yet.
Can I keep this pen going until we know which pensioners will get the winter fuel payment back? That's the question.
Putting the pen in pensioners. Right, Chris, thank you very much.
Ta-ra.
And Luke, good to see you too.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Now, from politics to gonorrhea, because today NHS England announced that England will become the first country in the world to immunise people against a sexually transmitted infection. Immunise, in other words, receiving a vaccine, and the STI that we're talking about is gonorrhea. And the person who can explain it all to us is our health and science correspondent and very old friend of Newscast, James Gallagher. Hello, James.
Thanks for having me back for gonorrhea.
Well, I mean, it's an important subject.
Very important subject.
Who is going to be getting this vaccine, first of all?
Yeah, this isn't one of those blanket vaccination programs that affects everybody. This is very highly targeted, and it's going to be for gay and bisexual men mostly, and those who have a recent history of multiple sexual partners or a recent sexually transmitted infection. Now, clinicians at sexual health clinics do have the discretion to give it to other people who they think are also at very high risk, but this program is very much aimed at that group.
And I looked at the document published last year by the JCVI, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation.
Well done.
Who we got to know very well during the COVID era. But I mean, they're still there beavering away on other things. And you can see they went through lots of options trying to work out what was the most cost-effective versus health-effective thing. And they looked at the option of, do you give it to every teenager as they reach the age of consent?
That has been trialled. So you know, this isn't actually a gonorrhea vaccine. It's a meningitis vaccine that is already given since 2015 to all babies in this country. Some scientists realized, wait a minute, gonorrhea and meningitis B, they're very closely related genetically, like 80-90% the same bacterium. Do these vaccines work? And so some of those trials did exactly that. They gave the vaccine to all teenagers, ideally before they became sexually active. And that's how we got this idea that it does actually reduce cases by 30 to 40%.
And that number, 30 to 40%, when we say that's across a population, isn't it?
Yeah,
that doesn't map on exactly to an individual.
No, so if you did it to everybody, you would expect a reduction in cases of about that amount. It doesn't mean that you have the vaccine and you're not going to get gonorrhea. So there is a slightly delicate conversation around, having that conversation with your doctor about, do you have this vaccine? Because take the maths roughly, there's less than 50% chance that it will prevent you from getting gonorrhea the next time you encounter it. So, it's not a guarantee. This is not going to give you immunity, but give it to enough people and you can bring cases down. And
again, it's back to that COVID era thing of something that helps the population overall, but doesn't necessarily help an individual.
It might help you. That's the thing. Or
the level of help is different.
Yeah, but things that gonorrhea isn't necessarily a particularly pleasant infection to have. It can have damaging impacts, kind of like within relationships if you have to have that conversation with sexual partners that you have gonorrhea. I mean, if you can avoid it, there's a lot of pros to avoiding having gonorrhea. Most people are lucky that they have a form of gonorrhea that is easily treatable with antibiotics, but we know that some people are getting the versions that are extremely drug resistant. So that actually the gonorrhea can be really hard to get rid of as well. So there are reasons to have it, even if it's not a guarantee that it's going to work for you.
And part of this is as a bit of an insurance policy for medicine against antibiotic resistant strains of gonorrhea, because if there's less of it circulating, you're less likely to end up with a strain that can just conquer all our drugs.
Yeah, basically. So if we go back through the history of this, so gonorrhea has obviously been around for ages, but if we go back to the 1940s, penicillin started to be used as an antibiotic, and it was great for gonorrhea back then. Within a decade, it wasn't really working very well at the dosage that they were using. They had to crank up the dose. A few years after that, it wasn't working very well at all. Had to turn to other drugs. And what we've seen since the 1940s all the way through to today is every single antibiotic that we've thrown at gonorrhea, it's found a way of getting around it. And it's starting to do that with the current first-line drug now. And you plot that trajectory, and eventually you might get to that point, and this is what some doctors are really worried about, that you get untreatable gonorrhea, because actually there's nothing that you can throw at it. I'm not saying we're there yet, but it's why there's a lot of focus on, can you prevent people getting gonorrhea in the first place rather than having to treat a particularly challenging infection.
And just in terms of the practicalities of the vaccination, do we know when clinics will be actually offering it to people when they
from
come to the door?
August?
So from August, so really soon.
Yeah. And I think the announcement today has been from NHS England, but I think we're quite likely to see other parts of the UK announcing it too. I think England just got there first.
And is it one dose? Is it 2 doses? Is it something you have to have every few years?
We don't know how often you're going to have this vaccine because it's all happened really quickly. So the evidence has all emerged only over the past couple of years. So could it be something that you only have one shot and you're done for life? We don't know. Or could you even get protection from that dose that you had as a baby? So we introduced the meningitis B vaccine in the UK in 2015. So those children are 10 now. It's going to take several more years whether we find out about whether that childhood dose is effective. But we just don't know because the science has happened so recently. We know 2 to 3 years is kind of pretty nailed on that it gives you protection for that long. It's probably a little bit longer, but how much longer, we don't know.
And riddle me this from a scientific point of view, but how is it that the bacteria that causes meningitis and the different bacteria that causes gonorrhea could be 80 to 90% genetically the same?
And yet cause dramatically different diseases. Like they couldn't be further apart in terms of like something that causes catastrophic swelling inside the brain and is fatal versus something that is spread through your sexual organs. I mean, like they are worlds apart in terms of kind of like their behavior and what they do. But I suppose that lots of things are very genetically similar. Like the difference between us and a chimpanzee is not that much, and yet look at us. Like the difference is massive. And so what it means is that the vaccine is able to hit what is common to both. I mean, it's not as effective against gonorrhea as it is against meningitis B, but it is those differences that make the two things unique.
And also medicine is full of things where it was tried for one thing or designed for one thing but ended up working on a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, this was in some ways planned, though. So one like the priority was getting the meningitis vaccine because it is a devastating disease in childhood. I mean, like a baby getting a meningococcal infection, that is a life-threatening within hours event. So that was the medical priority. But scientists have always known that these two species of bacteria, incredibly closely related, and so took the punt that actually one could do the job for the other. And that's how where we are today.
And then just to end on a more philosophical note, which is just the idea of talking about STIs, because I mean, the government and the health service, they have to do it no matter how embarrassed people are or how it might seem like intruding on people's privacy, because the rate of infections is going up and it costs the NHS lots of money and is potentially very damaging to people's health. Yeah, if you don't talk about it.
It depends who you're talking about, worrying about talking about it. I have found in my experience that if you go to a sexual health clinic, there's barely any embarrassment. They're from the doctors. Like, it is so day-to-day, you might as well be talking about the colour of paint you want on your walls. I mean, it's that kind of, or what you're going to have for lunch. That's the level. And this is being targeted at gay and bisexual men primarily. Again, I would say a community that is more aware of sexual health than probably any other aspect of society. So it's one of those things that I just wonder is, some people get really squeamish and queasy about it, but actually the people on the front line of dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, this is not that much different to going, do I need to take a statin for my heart? Yeah, and also STI testing now, certainly in some places in the UK, is just super slick now. And I think maybe people who haven't come into contact with that system might not realise that, but it's like in some cases it's as simple as doing one of those old COVID tests. I keep bringing up the COVID period. It's almost like that's when we spent hundreds of hours together. But like, it's not. So I think some people have a very old-fashioned view about how these services are delivered. Yeah, exactly. And I think the world has come on a lot, but at the same time it needs to, because STIs are a growing problem. I mean, you look at the figures, and since 2009, gonorrhea has gone from less than 20,000 to more than 80,000 cases a year. So quadrupling in a decade and a half. That is a trajectory that, if it is sustained, is problematic and is going to cost a lot of money to deal with, never mind all that drug-resistant aspect to it that we've talked about already. I mean, like the NHS is estimated could save £8 million or so over the next decade if enough people take up the vaccine. So, I mean, like, big numbers, lots of people involved. James, thank you. Adam, thanks. And that's all from this jam-packed episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.